Hello, everyone again. My name is Jana Wawrzyniak, University of Warsaw. I'm very privileged, delighted, and humbled to chair this final session of our conference, session titled Decolonizing Museums, a Global Perspective, with right now 4, but hopefully 5 distinguished speakers. Our task is to go back to some of the topics that we have discussed during the conference from divergent regional and professional perspectives. As there might be some people in the audience who have not followed the entire conference, or let me summarize that we are talking about the histories and the prospects of decoloniality in the museums of the region with its peculiar post-colonial, if you want to call it that way, historical situatedness. Firstly, in the land conquest of the 19th century, the countries of this region did not participate in the process of colonization as independent states, themselves being part of other land empires at the time. That contributed to the notion that they were yet another victim of great European powers and Ottoman Empire, rather than participants of Europe's worldwide colonial engagement. But what this discourse on internal colonization often misses is that for political and mostly economic reasons, East Central European population migrated globally, contributing to settlements around the world. And moreover, its elite often shared in the colonial aspiration of Western and Southern Europeans. For instance, some aristocrats kept black servants or decorated their palaces and gardens with Oriental goods, plants, and animals. Furthermore, East Central European travelers and explorers educated in St. Petersburg, Leipzig, Berlin, Vienna, Paris, or London participated in buying, exchanging, or stealing objects from other parts of the world. Some of those items found their way to ethnographic museums of the newly independent East Central European nation state after 1918. Also importantly, in the case, for instance, Poland, the colonial-like relations with peasants and minorities were replicated in the interwar period by the Polish-speaking elite and the territories of today's Western Ukraine, Belarusia, and Lithuania. The Cold War left a mixed legacy with regard to colonialism. On the one hand, the communist states supported the colonization movement around the world, which among others meant that Asian, African, or Latin American activists and students visited or lived in cities like Warsaw. Party propaganda stressed the communist bloc contribution to the liberation of humankind, not only from the chains of capitalism, but also from the accompanying forms of enslavement, including racial prejudice worldwide. On the other hand, however, the communist culture of knowledge, despite its decolonial component, contribute to the dissemination of the European vision of the world, not least by organizing all-white archaeological and ethnographic expeditions to non-European countries, which competed for local resources and contacts with those organized by capitalist states. Overall, the engagement of Eastern Europeans in other cultures left the region with an implicated legacy of colonial violence, even though it was filtered, nuanced, or enriched by communism and expanded by the region's own subjugation to foreign powers. Until today, this implicated legacy can be traced in museum collections, even though in a country like Poland, many of them were robbed by the Nazis during the Second World War. The overall situation is even more complex because of the experience of the Nazi and Soviet legacies, especially with the Nazi racist ideologies contributing to the Holocaust and racial humiliation of Slavs, with Nazi and Soviet regimes contributing to millions of deaths in this region, but also to numerous levels of implications of local communities in the atrocities of the 20th century. At the moment, some countries of the region, as Poland, are torn on the one hand by populism with its flourishing national and ethnocentric myths, and at the other are having an influx of multicultural workers from around the world somehow hidden behind anti-refugee rhetoric. In this context, some of the critically minded curators and museum directors would like to do something about the implicated collections, but at the same time, they often feel misunderstood or even attacked by the advocates of radical decolonial discourse. So I'm curious, what particular ideas, experiences, and concerns can our speakers share with this East Central European constellation from your very divergent perspective? And let me introduce the speakers in the alphabetical order. Marcia Chuva is a Brazilian historian, associate professor in the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, and researcher of the National Council of Research. Her main research interests focus on the history of heritage and memory policies, ethnographic museums, and the restitution of cultural assets in post-colonial context. She's also a member of the ECOS project coordinating the Brazilian team in cooperation with the University of Coimbra. Marcia has been with us for almost entire conference, as I said already, despite 5-hour time difference, so thank you so much. Barbara Kirchenberg-Gimblett is the chief curator of the core exhibition at Polin Museum of the History of Polish Jews and university professor emerita at New York University. She serves on advisory boards for the Council of American Jewish Museums, the Jewish Museum Vienna, Jewish Museum Berlin, and the Jewish Museum and Tolerance Center in Moscow, and advises on museums and exhibition projects in Lithuania, Belarus, Albania, Israel, and the United States. Let me also mention that she's extremely influential and generous in Polish context. Always we love her for her willingness to engage in the productive conversation. Wayne Modest, who is with us. Wayne, can you hear us? Because thank you. He's a professor of material culture and critical heritage studies in the Faculty of the Humanities at the Vrije Universiteit, Amsterdam. He has held visiting academic position at the University of Pennsylvania, New York University, and Yale University. He is, however, most known as the founding director of the Research Center for Material Culture, the umbrella research institute of the Tropen Museum, Museum Volkenkunde, the Africa Museum, and the Wereld Museum in the Netherlands, the center that serves as a focal point for research on ethnographic collections in the country. Wayne is also one of the most charismatic figures in today's museum scene. Dr. Katarina Muraska teaches art history at Birkbeck College, University of London. She was curator and deputy director of the National Museum in Warsaw, mentioned already several times at our conference, as well as guest professor at the Humboldt University, Berlin. Her publications include National Museum in Warsaw Guide, Galleries and Study Collection, Borders in Art, Revisiting Kunstgeography, from museum critic to the critical museum. Her recent book, Imaging and Mapping Eastern Europe, is under contract with Routledge. I'm also grateful to Katarzyna for being with us almost entire conference. And our final speaker, Jürgen Zimmerer, is professor of global history and the head of Research Center, Hamburg Postcolonial Legacy at the University of Hamburg. Between 2000 and 2017, he was founding president of the International Network of Genocide Scholars. He has also served as a senior editor of the Journal of Genocide Research. His research interests include German colonialism, comparative genocide, colonialism and the Holocaust, and environmental violence and genocide. His books, German Rule, African Subject, State Aspiration and the Reality of Power in Southwest Africa, and From Windhoek to Auschwitz and the Relationship Between Colonialism and the Nazism, are currently being translated and will be published in English in 2021. Jürgen has also been active in the debate on decolonization in Germany. I would like to ask each of the speakers for an opening statement, as we did in all other sessions. So we will just make an opening statement about each of you, and we will open simultaneously a discussion in chat. And after you present your respective position, we will ask you to address Q&A or to engage in discussion with each other. I would like to start with Wayne and Marcia, because their own work is most distant from East Central Europe, but because of that, it can also bring important insights that are somehow invisible for insiders. So my question to both of you, what are, according to you, the main challenges of the global trends in the current decolonization debate? What would be your advice to East Central European curators, and what experience could you share, would you be willing to share with them from your respective perspective? Can we start with you, Wayne, or you need a moment to connect?
Yeah. It wouldn't be fair for me to ask for a moment to connect, so I will just start. Thank you for inviting me, and sorry for my late joining you. I'm sorry that I have not been a part of the conversation. It is not because of it not being interesting, but for other things. What are the challenges? First, I want to start out by suggesting from my own interest and the work that we try to do here in the Netherlands, but more broadly, the work that we do, that I've been doing as well, to say that we've always been interested in the relationship between the post-colonial or questions of the colonial and questions that emerge from your own location. And that for me emerged primarily because of the work that I do on the Caribbean. And so one cannot necessarily see these as distinct histories primarily. And I'm sure many people would have said this in the conference already, but if we were to take, for example, somebody who we work with as an intellectual figure in the work that we've done here, this one figure, Anton de Kom, and Anton de Kom was from Suriname, was very important in the resistance movement in the Netherlands, wrote this wonderful book, We Slaves of Suriname, and is now regarded as an anti-colonial hero. I mean, a lot of Anton de Kom's framing in how we try to understand the question of the colonial, and therefore the question of the anti-colonial, and if we could say the question of the post-colonial, was one that was always trying to think beyond colonial as simply a racializing project. So the common notion of we slaves was embedded already in an idea of Marxism, thinking through the questions around labor and labor rights. So when he says we slaves, it was not necessarily about the enslaved alone, but he was thinking about what forms of social relations could be created by the laboring class in Suriname at the time, at the beginning of the 20th century, as a project of anti-colonialism. If you were to ask me what is at stake, so that's my first point. So I want to try to say that the work that we do is things in a certain kind of overlapping in between the questions of race and the questions of class, and how those overlap for us to think through or racial capitalism, to think through the work of the post-colonial work that we're trying to do, or the decolonial work that we're trying to do in the present. What are the major challenges? I would suggest that you've already articulated some of that. In the nationalist fervor that we now inhabit in Europe, we continue to struggle with the question of who the European is, how Europe has been influenced by the colonial project, what makes it so that Europe's current polity, the plural polity that we now live in, what created that plural polity, and how that connects with colonialism. And so any attendant to the question of decolonizing or decolonization, decolonizing the museum, must attend to the question of, at least in the Netherlands anywhere of Europe, for whom are we speaking about decolonization, and who is understood as the European, the citizen for whom the public institution is intended. In the current discussion, which has become a kind of vitriolic discussion that harkens back to an understanding of Europe as some kind of moment of racial purity and a certain notion of whiteness, that question of who the European is, and therefore who the public institution is supposed to serve, but who is supposed to be represented in the public institution as staff, at what levels, becomes a very, very complex question. And we continue to fight that with a rising populism in Europe today, which seem to suggest that a lot of the problems of Europe today, a lot of what is happening, and I've done it together with a colleague, Anouk de Koning, where we've been talking about Europe and its anxious politics. And in this anxiety moment, this anxious politics, we imagine that a lot of the ills of Europe today are caused by racialized others. So the question then, in trying to think decoloniality, decolonization, is one, how do we address the coloniality of the institutions themselves that we now work in, that are now supposed to serve the public, and that coloniality in how they emerged as spaces for thought. So the epistemological frames around which they were created, but also how those epistemological frames map onto a very racializing understanding of what Europe is, was, but also a big question of this notion of the human. Who is human enough, and what is at stake in that conversation? So we need to get, for us, the challenge is how do we go back to think through that coloniality, modernity link, which is where our museums emerge from, and that continue to haunt us as institutions, but also how this maps on in the present to the racializing precarities that we have, that continue to animate our discussions in the present about who is the public institution for, and more so, who is the citizen that is supposed to be represented in or by these institutions. We continue to struggle with those two, I would suggest those two poles in thinking about what decolonization could look like. A part of that struggle, I would suggest, is, in my view anyway, and what we've been thinking through, is the very difficulty that Europe has to address the question of race. And I would want to suggest, and I was in a previous conversation recently where I was talking about heritage studies and critical heritage studies, and the ways in which even such a new field struggles with the question of the mapping, how race itself is implicated in its conceptual argument, and how this new field already struggled with the question of race. So to answer your question, if decolonization is a horizon that we need to battle with, for us here, at the core of our struggle is that relationship between questions of coloniality, how coloniality has given form to the very institutions in which we work, but also the tentacular notion of coloniality that is that seeps into other institutional forms about where we operate. And therefore, when we use questions, even statement like diversity and inclusion in museums, how those also map onto racializing formation and what that means. And the question that we still continue not to ask about how race is so embedded, but so invisible, and racism actually, from our conversation very often in much of the work that we do. That kind of struggle is where we sit right now. And just to close with my opening statement, one of the things that we've been seeing though, and which gives us the kind of hope, is the kind of activist projects that are emerging outside the museum that has made us so uncomfortable as institutions over the last couple of years, which has been a good thing. Museums now are always on their tippy toes to try and think through their positionality and who works in them and what is at stake in that. But a part of that, what we've seen from outside is, especially with a lot of activists, and this is global activism that actually is connecting through social media and sharing ideas. And so one of the interesting things is how robust they have been, those who critique, in thinking coloniality as a capacious thing, not necessarily just about race, but its articulation with questions of class, with questions of gender, with questions of sexuality, and how that capaciousness gives us an opportunity to try and imagine the museum differently. Therefore, one of the things, for example, with Decolonize This Place in New York, where they tie the museum's coloniality with notions of gentrification and what that might mean. So in that horizon, in that opening for us to think critically, in Stuart Hall's conjunction in this moment, what it does for us is that it actually, and this is what I would like to suggest to you, it actually brings us together on two different sides of a conversation around how coloniality is embedded in our institutions with a more capacious construct, that decolonization is not just about a certain kind of racial project. It is a more capacious concept that gives us the opportunity to think through much more intersectionally about how race articulates with many other categories of difference, and what that might mean for us to push an agenda of justice, equality, those kind of things in museums. So that is what I would like to open up, to suggest that in this moment, and I want to put it bluntly to say, from your side and from the side of what we've been trying to do, there is an opportunity with a more capacious understanding of the decoloniality that could help us to push for more just institutions for the future that is much more inclusive and open to the plurality of our human formation with non-humans as well, or more than human, rather than just a singular understanding of the colonial or decolonial. I want to stop with that, and then we can get into a discussion.
Thank you so much, Wayne, for this very inspiring opening. Can we move to Marcia now? Marcia, would you like to share your slides with us?
Yes, just a minute, please. Here and yes. Okay. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm loving this meeting, this seminar, and I hope to dialogue with the others in this table, this round table. As Joanna gently put some questions, I'd like to touch them in my talk about restitution. And one of the different ways of decolonizing museum, bringing examples from Brazil and Portugal. Firstly, it's important to say that decolonizing here means emancipatory practices and attitudes that start a long process of changing and insights, transforming worldview and consciousness by facing the discomfort. To this goal, it's necessary to deal with uncomfortable narratives, not only the curator, but all the museum staff, the academic researchers, the public of the museum. In this view, the museum is a place of controversy, a place to produce historiographic reviews and new fresh narratives against the unique history. In Brazil, the independence from Portugal was in 1822, but the abolition of African slavery occurred only in 1888. In present time, 50% of Brazilian population declare themselves Black or brown, and the indigenous population is less than 10%. This is for you to have an idea of our population. The multicultural country that we are. Portugal kept colonies in Africa till 1975, and the migration is intense since the last 3 decades from ex-colonies, but African people are in Portugal since the beginning of the colonization, the 16th century. The African presence in both countries is the colonial heritage focused in my research, and the racism is the hidden legacy as well. Actually, restitution is not a global solution to decolonize museums, but it's a global problem. The discussion about restitution in Brazil and Portugal is just beginning, but I'd like to share some kinds of that I could identify looking for concrete cases. All of them are being touched or are by the racism. So, cases involving the state, the first, in the position of who required, sorry. This is the Tupinamba mantle in the Denmark Museum, was required in 2000. And we didn't get the mantle back. And there are in Europe, in 5 museums in Europe, 5 different mantles, Tupinamba mantles, none in Brazil. Case involving the state, but in the position of who is required. So we have in Latin American neighbors, Paraguay, that asked for the devolution of this cannon, El Cristiano, stolen by Brazilian army as a war trophy during the 19th century. Brazil diplomacy said that Paraguay could take the cannon if they can get it out of the museum. It weighs a ton. So it's like a joke because it's very difficult to take it out the museum. It would be very expensive. Well, those 2 cases, we could say that's a proper coloniality. And the third case, the third kind of cases is into the national boundaries. I could say the national coloniality. It can be seen by the Tariano indigenous group requiring further objects on the Indigenous Museum, that's a public museum in Manaus, in Amazonas, the north of the country. They are visiting at the first time, seeing their objects in display, and also in the technical reserve. It was a tense negotiation because they wanted to leave the museum with the objects in their hands at that time. Well, another case inside the boundaries, the national boundaries, is the Black people of Candomblé, that's an Afro-Brazilian religion, requiring the ritual objects arrested by the police as black magic, a forbidden practice in the first decades of the 20th century, and kept it in its museum. The police had a museum and they kept all these objects there till today, till now. Those people from the Candomblé organized a campaign called Liberte Seu Sagrado, Release Our Sacred, since 2018. And then in this year, 2020, those activists, the objects were released this year to the Republic Museums, also a public museum, who mediated and received the objects for custody in co-creation with the group. So I think it could be a very interesting example for the guide that Zilla presented us before. We could talk about this later. By other side, in Portugal, a generic request was made by Angola in 2011, and since 2018, the intention of Angola government to formalize a request for the restitution of cultural assets from the National Museum of Ethnology in Lisbon has been reported in the press. In reply, representatives of the Portuguese government declared open to the debate. On the contrary, the director of the museum said that it is an inappropriate demand. Why? He said, what does this museum created in 1965 have to return to the former colonies? Very little or nothing. As it was created late, it never was a museum of the colonies, unlike many of its European contemporaries. I don't know because, however, the evidence show us the opposite, as from 1965 to 1973, the museum organized more than 20 missions to Africa for its anthropologists, or should I say robbers, as we talked another day, to collect objects in the African colonies urgently because they could lose them very quickly. And actually they lost the colonies in 1975. Well, the examples briefly presented are saying that decolonizing museums by restitution or by other ways means to face historiographic issues that involve uncomfortable stories, difficult pasts, and sensitive memories, and that needed to overcome this is a profound revision of national narratives and colonial history. This is, I'm sorry, Angolan, that's the permanent exhibition, Angolan Port Leads with sayings. This is a very humiliating photo that is in the permanent exhibition. And those dolls are one of the main objects asked for restitution. Well, I'm sorry. Well, very similar to what I have seen in Weltmuseum Wien that I can't speak now because I don't have time. It's a very interesting experience that we could talk after. And Austria admits its participation in colonialism very recently, and they are really decolonizing some sessions of this Weltmuseum. They are also facing their discomforts at all. Unfortunately, I can't talk about this now. In my opinion, a historiographic challenge is the center of, yes, I can come back. I'm sorry.
Marcia, I'm sorry, could you wrap up in the next 2 minutes?
Yes, you can close the presentation, please. So to answer Joanna, the main advice, if there is any advice I could share with you, are the 3 theses in which I based my research. The first thesis is that the museums should put their own trajectories under lights to be observed, criticized, reframed, not throwing away. State museums need to interrogating themselves internally and be open to deal with provocative and uncomfortable questions coming from the public and especially from the ears of this spoliation. The second thesis is related to the fact that to reveal their own histories mean to delegitimation of established situations. It requires a decolonial turn to produce historiographical revision about the nation building history. The third thesis, and the last one, is the restitution as a challenge that involves new relations with the past and the future. Europe decolonizing itself of its former colonies by one side, and by the other, ex-colonies demanding restitution facing their own challenge. The deconstruction of European canons and the valorization of their own heritage in Africa. Concluding, my advice could be to not discard the hypothesis that difficulties in dealing with uncomfortable past can lead to solutions that erase institutional trajectories, as can be seen in the National Museum of Ethnography in Lisbon. To include the decolonizing theme in the daily lives of state museums is necessary, by one hand, to adopt an approach that situates coloniality in broader global historiography, by the other, to focus on their own histories. I mean, local singularities and global issues. The Weltmuseum Wien bravely has done, but it's another story I can talk after. Thank you very much. I'm sorry if I used more time than I could.
Thank you very much, Marcia, for this very important insight, which complements what Wayne said. So we have both, like one angle is like looking for the intersectionality, race, class, sexuality from today's perspective, but also to scrutinize very carefully our historiographies, museum collections, and also co-curating with source communities, subject which we also discussed at this conference. And from this kind of global insights from Wayne and Marcia, we were moving and kind of spotlighting into the region, but also the regional connection with wider world. And we moved to now to first we start with a historian, with Jürgen Zimmer. Could you see how these matters looks from your perspective, and especially research on entanglements between the Nazi, the historical entanglements between colonialism and Nazism, and what to do with that today?
Okay, thank you, thank you, Joanna. Thank you very much, all of you, for having me here. When preparing this talk, I felt strongly, and even stronger now listening to the first two papers, that I'm sort of the odd one out. I'm neither a museums person or a museum specialist, nor am I an expert on Eastern Europe. I'm a historian. I'm a historian, a German historian, and a German historian of German colonialism in one particular colony in German Southwest Africa. And I'm saying that because what I try to present here is rooted in this biography and in this position. I don't have to know, I don't know whether it's the same in all the countries, but in all the countries, but in Germany we have a very, very particular setup. And I think what makes the German experience different is that you can raise the question what colonialism is and where colonialism took place. Because in my interpretation, Germany was a classic, quote unquote, colonial empire between 1884 to 1918. And this relates basically to the experience of other European colonial powers. As Joanna said, in the Polish context, even without having formal colonies, many Polish people were implicated in the colonial project of other European countries. The same is true for Germany. So it doesn't really start in 1884. It starts in the 15th, 16th century. What makes the German experience different is that I think Germany had lost its colonies after World War I, formally lost it, and tried to have a second shot at having a colonial empire. And that is in 1939 with the invasion of Poland, and then in 1941 with the invasion of the Soviet Union. Because if you break down the war aims, the initial war aims to conquer space and to resettle this space, what I said, reordering space in relation to race, please race in quotation marks, then you see that you have a almost classic colonial situation. However, not very many people in Germany particularly would regard the war of 1939-41 as a colonial war. They would simply not understand it as that. And that has to do, I think, with the imagination that colonialism took place somewhere outside Europe. It is a relationship between Europeans and non-Europeans, between whites and non-whites. That's the image. The reality is that colonialism is a construction, and it can be geographically moved, and that you can indigenize people. You can, and that what the Nazis, and when I mean Nazis, I would make like the point, I use it as a shortcut. I mean Germans, because I think it's very dangerous to say the Nazis had. I mean, the Nazis is the majority of German people between 1933 and 1945 wanted that and did act and commit these crimes. Now I lost my, what was the last point I said? That Germany wanted to create a colonial situation, and that they, in doing so, they constructed the Poles, the Russians, or the Slavs in general as a people, as a colonial people. You can boil it down to individual measures and announcement during the war. And this is a good case to show that colonialism is a relationship between two people or between two collectives, and can apply it basically everywhere, which means that to decolonize, we really have to unearth the mechanisms of colonialism, and then have to sort of unlearn the colonial gaze and this colonial mentality. Now, I don't want to go into details about this hypothesis of mine from Windhoek to Auschwitz, from Windhoek to Warsaw, as I've called some of my publications, because it's not really the topic of this conference. It's just the showcase for me to say what we need to do is to understand what colonialism is, and that we, even if we were not, or you are not part of the colonial history as a perpetrator, you're also part of the colonial history, because colonial history also takes place within Europe. Now, I think the German dealing with this history is quite interesting, because whereas it has become something like formative for German post-war identity to accept the crimes of the Third Reich, of Germans during the war, Germany is not willing to accept responsibility and the colonial crimes. And to give you just an idea about the German colonial crimes, is when you read about the racial state after 1939, which the Germans wanted to establish in Eastern Europe. The first racial state in German history took place from 1900 onwards in what is today Namibia. When you talk about the genocides of World War II committed by Germans, bear in mind that the first genocide of the 20th century was committed by German colonial troops in Namibia. And the German public and the German politicians don't want to accept it. And that, you ask why somebody who praises or themselves for accepting historical guilt and historical wrongs so hesitant to accept this. And that leads basically to a German narrative where I think that the German public narrative slowly decenters the focus on the Third Reich and want to go back in its narrative to a Germany prior to 1914. You may all heard about the Prussian palace rebuilt in Berlin to be opened in December this year, hosting the Humboldt Forum and also the ethnological collection. This is an attempt to erase parts of Germany's history in the 20th century, the violent parts, and go back to a supposedly better Germany in the 19th century. By going back to this, they go back to Berlin as the capital of discoveries, of scholarship, of ethnology, and of collections, and go back to a colonial setting, which in an international debate is already questioned and saying this colonial relationship is problematic. And that is so difficult. I think that is the main difficulty for understanding the entire problem. Now, what are the ways out? I think the German debate on the restitution of looted colonial objects, for example, got a great push because of the German rules about the restitution of looted Nazi art, Jewish artwork which was looted or which was sold under pressure. And I think this is important because the German regulations basically say that even if you sold artwork as a Jew during the Third Reich, we can assume that this is maybe looted or put not on you haven't sold it on your free will and you haven't got a fair price because the system was deeply unjust. And I think that is what we have to apply, and which the German government refuses to apply, by the way, also to colonialism, because colonialism is also a system of structural racism and structural injustice. So we just have to assume that objects acquired during colonialism are acquired unfairly and should be restituted, unless a museum can prove that it has acquired it fairly. I don't want to exclude that the possibility exists that objects were sold for a fair price and with free will, but I think the burden of proof is on the museums. And that way, I think we can bring both experiences, the Nazi experience, the Third Reich, and the colonial experience together, because we can draw solutions from the ways we worked out how to deal with Jewish property, which was acquired by German institutions. And I think that is something we should acquire, because what we need, in my perspective, is a more universal understanding of colonialism and a more universal understanding of how to deal with it, and that the problem of looted objects is a universal problem. And we should know, I'll wrap up in 20 seconds. It's a universal problem, and we should not pack it into different containers, but get together and find a solution how to deal with these looted objects. Thank you.
Thank you, Jürgen, so much for this important insight from Germany. And now we would like to move to Barbara Kirschenblatt-Gimblet, asking her, it's up to you if you would like to speak more from the regional perspective, or if you would like to comment how the current decolonial debate does it, if and how does it matter for Jewish museums more globally, as obviously the issue of race has always been embedded into them, but how do they engage, or how might they engage with the current discussions? What's your view on this?
Well, thank you very much, Joanna. I'm delighted to be part of the Roundtable, and I congratulate you and your colleagues on organizing this conference, which is which has launched a very important discussion. So here's what I would argue. First of all, I believe that one of the questions that was raised at the beginning of the Roundtable is, what are our starting points? And very briefly, I would say that our starting points are the new museology, which is now not so new. We can say it's a 50-year project. And it was a project of what Kasia would call museum critique. And the second starting point is very recent, which is ICOM's effort to write a new definition of museum, which would move us from, as Kasia would put it, from museum critique to critical museology. And for me, the Decolonizing Museum project is a project of moving from critique to the critical museum. So that would be the first. then the question is, what does decolonizing mean in the context of Jewish and Holocaust museums, and specifically in East and Central Europe, but within an international perspective, because this whole field is very, very international. And I'm reminded of a comment by Dariusz Stola, the wonderful former director of Polin Museum of the History of Polish Jews. And in the context of what continues to be a very bitter, if you will, debate and very vexed topic, which is the relationship between Poles and Jews during the Second World War, during the Holocaust, and specifically Polish violence against Jews in that context, what Dariusz Stola said is that we today, those of us born after the war, are not responsible for what those before us did, but we are responsible for what we do with that knowledge. And that seems to me to be at the very heart of what Polin Museum and other museums dealing with this difficult history, that is their responsibility. The responsibility of what we do with the knowledge that we have, even if we are not ourselves directly implicated in those crimes. So what does that mean concretely? And when we say decolonizing, obviously the word colonizing suggests a very specific historical situation. But I take the term broadly to refer to a set of values that I think that this decolonizing move really express. And that is the values of diversity, inclusion, fighting xenophobia of all kinds. And most recently in Poland, the right-wing party running on a platform of homophobia and anti-LGBTQ and resistance to it, which I think shows that there is a certain resilience in civil society, even in contexts that are quite authoritarian. And so consistent with ECOM's attempt, not yet successful, to write a new definition of museums, museums are, if you will, or can be, and in the case of ECOM's definition, should be agents of repair that create new narratives and that engage in practices of restitution, repatriation, collaboration, shared authority. These are all values that we associate with the decolonizing of museums. So that I would say when I say decolonizing museums, I think of it as a set of values rather than a specific set of historical circumstances, though obviously that is a factor as well. And so consistent with the ICOM attempt at a new definition, the mission of museums becomes, if you will, they become agents in civil society and extremely important agents in the development of 21st century competencies. And those competencies have to do with historical awareness and with the responsibility for the knowledge that we have of what has happened in the past, even if we're not directly involved. Now, if we come to post-war Poland, because I want to move us into our territory, we have a very specific situation. And I think it would be interesting to compare it with some of the contexts that we have been talking about, well, throughout the conference, but also already in the previous, presentations by the previous speakers. So first of all, in the case of post-war Poland, we have a shift from what was once the home to the largest Jewish community in the world, certainly in Europe, to one of the smallest, from 3,300,000 Jews before 1939 to thousands of Jews today. So 90% of the Jewish population of Poland was murdered during the Holocaust. That is very specific. Secondly, we have moved from a Poland that was once one of the most, if not the most diverse country in all of Europe, to a country that is one of the most homogeneous, which of course is a breeding ground for a strongly, I would say, ethno-national country. And certainly with the right-wing government, that's the direction that it's gone. So this is a very specific context. So what does this mean for the role of Jewish and Holocaust museums in East and Central Europe? It means that they are, if you will, well, one of the interesting questions for Jewish museums in Europe generally is, are they Holocaust museums by another name? Because in many ways, you could say that for some of them, they are museums of a murdered people that attempt to, if you will, recover and communicate the world that they created and that was destroyed with them, and to also, in some ways, signal the renewal of Jewish life on a relatively small scale. So that means that in large measure, they're not created by Jews, and their public isn't really a Jewish public. So it's a very, very, very specific situation. And in the case of Poland and other parts of East and Central Europe, we're dealing with a politics of history and a history of politics. And the case of Poland is a very difficult situation because that policy is about defending the good name of Poland, and there is no place for dissent, which means that if the Poland Museum deals with anti-Semitism, anti-racism, anti-xenophobia, LGBTQ rights, human rights, etc., this is now seen, and this is relatively new in the last maybe 3 or 4 years, as, quote, anti-Polish, which means that in the Polish context, a so-called Museum of Jewish History actually has to navigate between two models of what that Jewish history is. Is it a history in which Jews are agents in their own history, or is it a history of Polish-Jewish relations, which is essentially a history of Polish anti-Semitism? And that is that is absolutely critical. Now, I'll make a couple of more comments because I want to stay within the 10 minutes. And that is, I'll maybe conclude with this, and that is, what is the place of the Holocaust in exhibitions of Jewish history? And this is, whether it's in Poland, in other parts of East Central Europe, whether it's in Paris, London, New York, Jerusalem, wherever it might be, this is really critical. And the question is, are these histories, whether it's 2,000 years of Jewish history in Berlin, whether it's 1,000 years at Poland Museum, is the Holocaust the defining moment in this history? Does this history begin with hate and end with genocide? Is the Holocaust the lens through which to see this history? Should one, in visiting this history from the medieval period forward, be foreshadowing the Holocaust? Should one be backshadowing and looking at this history through the lens of the Holocaust? In other words, are we looking at what you might call a teleological history? Well, at Poland Museum, we absolutely reject all of that. And for us, in our approach to the historical narrative, it is critically important. And I think that it's probably much more of an issue in Europe than it is in the United States, but that would be a wider conversation. But our goal is to implement or to express a fundamental paradigm shift from the history of Polish Jews as a history of Polish-Jewish relations to a history of Polish Jews in which they are agents in their own history, which of course includes, I wouldn't even call it Polish-Jewish relations. It includes their relationship with everybody among whom they lived. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. It means, what is today Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, other parts of the region. So in this regard, I would conclude by saying that the decolonizing move is a move that is best understood as a set of values arising out of a critical perspective of museums as agents of colonialism, and that those values are extremely important in a much broader array of museums and their topics. So maybe I'll conclude with that to stay within my 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, Barbara. And now we move to Katarina, who I believe would also like to share her critical view on that, what's going on in the museum space in Poland now.
Yes, I'm just trying to find my presentation, which I hope it is this one. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
So thank you very much for inviting me and for this wonderful conference. I really did enjoy it, and I did part in almost every session. So, and I learned a lot, and I actually have to rewrite my book now, or at least parts of that. And
excuse me, Katarina, would you mind turning on the full screen slide?
Yes, of course. Yes. This is what I forgot about. Yes, there it is. No, sorry. This is totally wrong. We start from the beginning. There it is. So I'm going to read in order to make my 10 minutes. So the advantage of speaking at the end is a possibility of testing your pre-conference ideas when listening to other speakers and discussions. And therefore, I decided to return to East Central Europe rather than looking at the relationship between British imperialism and post-communist museums. I mean, British post-imperialist museums and Polish post-communist museums, or something like that. So 3 major points I want to make. First, and thank you, Barbara, for referring to the concept of the critical museum. So I ought to stress the relationship between the imperative to decolonize museum with the program of the critical museum, which had been devised by the late Piotr Piotrowski when becoming the director of the National Museum in Warsaw. I was his deputy. My point here is that, and this is, I'm referring to what Wayne has said and Jürgen to a large extent, is that the criticality of the critical museum embraces decolonization in the same way in which it embraces the issues of class, race, gender, and sexuality. The second point I want to, so this is more kind of, let's say, theory. The second point is more about practice. This is the issue of practice, and it connects to Erica's earlier question 2 days ago, I think, about the addressee of the knowledges produced by museums. So I gave it a title, Museums and the Realignment of the Field. I'm borrowing, obviously, this phrase from Pierre Bourdieu, whose first book, The Love of Art, 1966, which was based on data collected also in the Museum of East Central Europe, proved that they address the middle class. So the issue is not only how to be critical while keeping museum sponsors' budget, not to offend the trustees and existing audiences. And this is the comment to our previous discussion, that those practical issues are very important when we write a manual how to decolonize museum. But so it's not only how to be critical, but how to extend, but to what extent the rethinking, queering, and decolonizing museums would actually make an impact, instigate a change in the relations of power. And if I have time at the end, I would like to flaunt briefly the idea of Critical Museum of East Central Europe, a virtual project. So now a few words about the Critical Museum, which was devised as a matrix of the critical institution, which would abandon the old idea of celebrating the imperial past, or the concept of the aesthetic value, which is endemic for art museums, and would provide instead a forum for debates on the major issues which are relevant for contemporary societies, both local and global. The project of transforming the museum in Warsaw into a critical institution, just to remind some dates, was carried out throughout the 14 turbulent months between August 2009 and October 2010. It envisaged the museum which consciously and purposefully uses its collections, its resources, its space, and its authority to respond to the world outside its walls. It stressed the importance of reflexivity. This is the second point on those, this kind of diagram, I mean the bullet points on top. A self-critical reflection on the museum's power laying bare its actions. And that actually, this point created a major outbreak. And I still remember when I was attacked by my former professor from the time when I was studying art history, who told me that, actually he addressed me, that I'm destroying the museum, I disgrace this wonderful, noble institution by, for instance, bringing the idea of the Ars Homoerotica exhibition as our major exhibition. The aims of decolonization, those two last points in green, even if not spelled out in our initial program, had formed part of it in a way. And East Central Europe as an entity was also always at the core of our critical agenda. We wanted to have a research center for Institute for Advanced Studies for studying East Central Europe, and the project of our exhibition, which of course was not realized for 2018, was to be about mapping of East Central Europe, throughout the history. But Ars Homoerotica was our major project, the only project which was fully realized, the opening of which you see in this picture on the screen. It effectively alienated our sponsors and some audiences. We didn't get any money from our sponsors. Everything, the whole exhibition had to be paid from the museum budget. But it also widened the constituency of our visitors considerably. It also ended our careers in the museum. But did it realign the field? I'm skeptical about that. So 10 years later, barely a month ago, the same courtyard of the museum has been chosen as the site for installing a statue of John Paul II at his 100th birthday. It shows the Pope standing in the middle of the fountain in the act of throwing a meteorite into this fountain, or you may say the courtyard. It is a manifest response to Maurizio Cattelan's sculpture, which is on the right, showing the Pope on the red carpet struck by a similar meteorite. In the words of the artist Jerzy Kalina, the Pope is fighting against the Red Plague, excommunicating all kinds of social radicalisms, including the LGBTQ movement, and the struggle against the criminalization of abortion, a long struggle in Poland, to which the red waters and those little objects in the fountain allude in the most drastic way. The statue excommunicates everything what our exhibition had stood for. The very positioning of the sculpture raises for me the question about the impact of our exhibition. The Pope statue has been widely laughed at, parodized, etc. But I have not noticed any protests from the National Museum's curators, as if there was no resistance whatsoever, which was so strong when Ars Homoerotica was being prepared. The most recent news from Warsaw, in response, they are not recent news, but I just want to put the slide already. The most recent news from Warsaw in response to the criminalization of abortion testify, however, to a serious revolt, which is literally going on outside the walls, I mean, as we speak, which is raised by the people. The museum, however, does not have any, doesn't contribute to it in any way. If at all, it actually instigates, no, it actually is a perpetrator in a way. It confirms, it accepts the sculpture in the courtyard. And do correct me, perhaps I'm wrong, so do correct me if I'm wrong. Okay, I would have, the fight for abortion was a long story. Why was there no exhibition on maternity and choice, on, you know, one of those exhibitions which would be one of those uncomfortable narratives, or on the fallen woman and their suicides, etc., etc. There should have been something like that, and there was nothing like that. Museums kept silence. So I want to invite you to join the debate about the impact of ars homoerotica, about the impact of curatorial activism. An online event stage in cooperation between Birkbeck, University College London, and the Courtauld, which is, the event is free, but you have to book your place, and there is a link. There is a link below. I also put it everywhere on Facebook, etc., etc. We are very happy that we are going to have Paweł Leszkowicz, the curator, and Tomek Kitliński, his partner and political activist, and we are going to have Maura Riley, who is the author of the book Curatorial Activism, which actually featured ars homoerotica, and Anastasia Fyodorova, the curator of the Curating Queer Russian Power, and a Polish artist active in London, which she produces fantastic work, and we are going to look at it. So this is one. There are those two issues which I have finished, but how am I for time? Can I say something about this idea of the a museum of East Central Europe?
1 minute.
1 minute. Okay. So yes. So I will read it very quickly. In 2018, the Museum of Black Civilizations opened in Dakar, aiming to represent the entirety of African cultures. I'm referring to it because East Central Europe has been a bit like Africa, composed of many diverse nations, religions, languages, and cultures. We had learned about it during the conference. We fight for East Central Europe by contesting its marginalization in many different ways, producing new knowledges, or those knowledges are produced by museums. Perhaps we can go one step further and create a critical museum of East Central Europe, a virtual one. Of course, there are already research institutions such as those in Marburg, Krakow, Bucharest, not to mention Central European University. There are also excellent websites, there are books and periodicals. There is no museum though. A metaphorical museum, which would exist as an online project, not reduced to the 20th century, but recognizing the region's history, including the multiple acts of colonizations. In contrast to existing research centers, which prioritize texts and books, the museum, like Abby Warburg's Mnemosyne project, would collect images. This is my idea. The material will be object-free. Would collect images, would be object-free. So there is no issues of restitution. And they would exist in their virtual presence by links. The image of East Central Europe is actually, this is the topic of my new book, composed of raw material assembled online from source communities as well as implicated communities, bringing in one virtual place links to maps, books, artwork, scores, cities, museums, testifying to the diversity of the complex and contested heritage of the region. And you can recognize some of the images which I have stolen from your presentations during the conference. That's it. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Katarina, for two important points. One is bringing some pessimism into our initial discussion, which was about showing us the current limits for the coloniality in the current political situation, but also for showing us this beautiful digital project of East Central Europe, which might make our discussion still alive, even if we will have some difficulties to do it on site because of pandemic or political reasons. So thank you so much. And now we have questions. We have questions for, one question is for all participants, and there are a specific question, I think, to Jürgen and to Barbara. Some other might be still in the making in the chat. So what I would propose, because as always we are running against the time, that I will just read all these questions which we have, and then we will make a final round, and you can reply to any of these questions if they are directed to you, or to refer to any other of the statements that you have heard from other speakers. So there is a question from on the chat from Anna to all of you. Should there be different strategies and paths of decolonization by state museums and local community museums on the other hand? So I think she would like to distinguish between the national containers and different and many different other community or other museums. And then there are two questions to Jürgen. First one, how could you define the dynamic of relationship between racial order and colonialism practiced by Germans? What were the main changes of the World War II practices in contrast to previous colonial experience? So what does the mid-century changes to that, what was going on in the 20th century changes in relation to 19th century. A question from Erika Lehrer, also to Jürgen. Is some of the resistance to owning up to the colonial past in Germany related to current immigration issues or implications? Justice not only for inanimate objects that were brought in, but animate bodies now wanting to follow them, in a sense, asks Erika. And then a question from Radek Przedpełski to Barbara. When developing your project of Pauline as a critical museum, were you also resonating with the Bundist concept of Deutschheit or Herness? This Yiddish heritage is something Warsaw-based Polish-Jewish artists, intellectuals, and activists such as Anna Rosenfeld and Rafael Rogiński are drawing on in their practice. And also there are some other comments in the chat, so if the speakers want, they can just scroll them on and refer in the final statement. So I would just start again with Wayne, Marcia, Jürgen, Barbara, and Katarzyna to again fight against the running time. Wayne, how do you feel with all that Eastern European complexities about race, class, intersexuality, and gender, and problems which we do encounter here? Oh, you are muted.
Quickly rush through a few things. First of all, thank you again, and thank for all of the presenters. To Anna's question, I think that every institution, while coloniality is a massive beast that that holds us in duress in many different ways, I think institutions, for me anyway, need to respond to them with certain kinds of specificity. An ethnographic museum has a specific kind of historical practice that relates to coloniality in a particular kind of way that might be different from an art museum, but both of them must deal with the coloniality. And I think that that also has relationship with questions of the nation or the local or whatever. I think so. So all of us need to respond, but differently. And in a way, if we were to take it up in its different formations, that's how we can actually address the beast. Because I think what I see anyway in our practice is that everybody seems to want to work to address coloniality in the same way. And then it leaves out some of the issues that are happening in other institutions. That's one thing. I want to do something which is kind of rude right now by saying, just in response to a few of the statements, one of the interesting things I think we should think about is that coloniality cannot be limited to the national moment when we were colonial. coloniality is a bigger project than our own colonial limitation. So whether or not we entered into it into the 1890s and exited it in the 1918s, as Jürgen suggests, one needs to think of the coloniality of which we are dealing with as something that is much broader, which is, for example, as some people in the decolonial movement from Latin America, such as Rolando Vasquez, would think coloniality as beginning with 1494, and what that might mean in terms of how that affects how we understand our knowledge formations, but the very idea of the human and what is human in the world and who is still regarded as human. That is one thing. My last provocation in response is I want to ask us, shouldn't we be more critical of what we understand as critical heritage, critical museology, critical whatever studies? Because my concern with that is that sometimes it gives the possibility, and I'm actually wanted to ask Barbara this. Sometimes we use these words like shared authority, all of the nice words that emerge from museology and critical museology. But it is also true that with all of the 50 years of critical museology, we still inhabit a decolonial moment where the kind of racial violence that institutions are practicing are still so strong and urgent. So I wonder, what is the failing of critical museology? What is the failing of museology as a whole, or critical heritage studies, that we use these terms critical, but then they don't really map on any kind of real political landscape to try and address some of the very urgent ways in which people are denied justice in the world today. My last point is this: in terms of the restitution, I want to go back to something that Peter touched. A part of our conversation is, for me anyway, restitution is an opportunity to go back to probably a Rawlsian understanding of how we can redistribute just heritage goods, just heritage formations. And Peter just says, everybody's crying out for peace, nobody's crying out for justice. And I'm interested in restitution, reparation, as an attempt at this, at imagining a just future, which I think is what our decolonial movements are asking for. So in a lot of the decolonial movements, I think they give, especially outside the museum, they give us some hints at that complex entanglement between race, class, gender, sexuality. And we need to look at that in this present moment, because diversity, inclusion, critical museology, critical heritage studies perhaps have failed us in trying to really think through how we have denied some people even of the conception of humanity. And that includes women, people of multiple gender formations, and racialized peoples. That is my last contribution.
Joanna, you're muted.
Yes, now I was muted. Thank you, Wayne, so much. So maybe as Wayne posed a direct question to Barbara, maybe Barbara, you would like to speak the first, and then to answer some additional questions which were addressed to you by Radek, and then we go to Marcia, Katarina, and Jürgen.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And yes, Wayne, I think you're absolutely right that there is a kind of mantra which sounds great, but doesn't necessarily translate into meaningful steps and an assessment of impact. So I couldn't agree more. And so I think taking a critical approach to our advocacy for a critical approach, I think is very, very well taken. So there were three comments, and I want to address each of them briefly. First of all, Doigkeit, the idea of here-ness. Absolutely a critical concept in the creating of Poli Museum. And the idea being that home is where we live, not somewhere else. And in the case of Polish Jews, it means where we have lived for 1,000 years continuously, and the language and culture, the world that Jews living in this territory created. And the sense that this is a whole world, and that it has value because there's a tendency to think of the diaspora as displacement, exile, as homelessness, placelessness, unrootedness. But the idea that you could be a co-territorial minority, be fully rooted and fully part of the place in which you've lived for 1,000 years, this is a critical starting point for the history of Polish Jews as we tell it. And it is a way of thinking that is, I would say, in a kind of dialogue with the immigration story, with the Zionist story. It's very interesting to see it in relationship to quite different approaches to the history of Polish Jews. The secondly is a question about diversity, and it's a very good question. So what I would say is, first of all, that diversity in Poland, there is diversity in Poland today, but there are three aspects of it that really distinguish it from the much greater diversity historically in Poland. That is to say, when I say Poland, I mean the historical territory of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which was much more diverse, much more diverse than Poland today. So what does that mean? Well, first of all, there is an anti-immigration policy, and it is true that there's a very large Ukrainian immigration in Poland, but it's kind of under the radar. The government tries not to call attention to it. Some of it is long-term, if not permanent immigration, but a lot of it is economic immigration. So it's back and forth. It's very specific to this moment, and it's very specific to Poland. But but definitely yes, it's very big. The single largest immigrant group, other than the Ukrainians, are in fact Vietnamese, and they arrived from basically communist Vietnam in the 1970s. Being Catholic and communist, they were the perfect immigrants. So they, you might not expect it, but yes. But overall, I would say maybe excluding the Ukrainian immigrants, you've got about 4% of the population is not, quote, ethnically Polish, Catholic, etc. And you have to compare that with the pre-war situation during which approximately 40% of the population of Poland was not ethnically Polish. They were Jewish, Ukrainian, German, Belarusian, but they were not ethnically Polish. So from 40% to 4%, I think that actually really says something. And then finally, there's a question about the virtual. It's a word I try my hardest to remove from my vocabulary because it explains too much and nothing. And the question was about the Gwoździec wooden synagogue that we built and the value that we placed on the recovery of the knowledge of how to build it, which is to say on intangible heritage over the so-called original object, meaning from the original material. And we insist that the result is not virtual. And it's not virtual, it's not a simulation, a recreation, a facsimile, a copy, a restoration. It's not any of those things. It's actually a new kind of object, but that's for a longer conversation.
Thank you so much. Marcia, for instance, and Katarina and Jürgen. Marcia, how also, I mean, my general question is also if you, how do you feel about this concept, decolonial and critical? I mean, do you think that critical is stronger or decolonial is stronger? And what do we need?
Yeah. Well, thank you for the question. Decoloniality, I think that it's much more strong. Because it comes together with the coloniality, of course, and it means something like a modern colonial world system. We are talking about something much broader than relations, specific relations. We are talking about practices and culture, and so that's why I think the first question. We can't, all the museums also, as Wayne talked, all museums have to think about their colonial practices it rooted in society. I don't know how to speak it. It's a daily practice. It's naturalized in societies, and we can't see racism, we can't see prejudice, and in thinking about the relation between Brazil and Portugal, we have an important theory that the Lusotropicalism that defended during the 20th century, that built the idea of a racial democracy in Brazil and soft colonialism in Portugal. And this, the same Lusotropicalism used by the Portuguese government and thinking, it's rooted in the societies, in both societies. And we are always fighting against the idea of racial democracy and this idea of the soft colonialism, a different colonialism in Portugal. So they are so violent. The slavery in Brazil produced a terrible effects to today, and the racism is naturalized in society. And I think that decolonizing is, decoloniality is a very strong, much more strong concept than today, than the critical mythology, as you said.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Marcia. Now we move to Katarzyna, who I guess would also like to express her view on this. So also, Katarzyna, some specific question to you. You might address them now, or you might address them in the breakout room session. I just very quickly read them so you are not left in the air. Very broad question, and I don't think we have still time to answer it broadly. Anna, what about critically reflecting on the concept of East Central Europe itself? This is what we had in one of the previous sessions, a quite robust discussion on that. Second, how to outline the borders of historical and civic responsibility for the museums? Third question, Magdalena Wróblewska asked, did you recall the Museum of Black Civilization in Dakar as a source of inspiration for Museum of East Central Europe? And finally, Monika Stobiecka asked, I would like to ask if you see any possibility for a renewal of the concept of a critical museum under current political circumstances. Do you think smaller, maybe local site of resistance can function currently in Poland?
Oh, thank you very much for all the questions. So perhaps I won't address the issue of criticality versus decoloniality. Well, we can see them as kind of being hinged on more or less the same approach. I do not want to see that one of them is stronger, but you're right that obviously today the decoloniality is becoming, goes to the forefront of our thinking. But criticality is perhaps a more kind of common word, which embraces critical approaches to everything, or queering. Queering is another word for me, which is about everything. But probably we can discuss it much longer. The criticality, I mean, reflecting on the concept of East Central Europe itself, of course, yes. And hence the idea of the virtual museum rather than any attempt to produce a real museum, because the concept of East Central Europe moves constantly and changes, you know. So and we witnessed that during the discussion about the term East Central Europe. I have also another approach to that, thinking about the image of East Central Europe. But let's not go on to that. Perhaps we will have some time in those breakout rooms. Outline borders of historical and civic responsibility for the museums. For me, in ideal way, there are no borders. Borders will be established anyway by the lack of money, by unwillingness of museum trustees to agree with your program, by loads of practical factors. Otherwise, museums should be able to comment on everything. on all injustice. This is what Barbara said, that museums are agents of the civil society. And I do believe that the museums are agents of civil society and not temples of art or historical mausoleums. This is my view, but of course I know it's very provocative. And it's not many of you would agree. Yes, about the Museum of Black Civilizations in Dakar, it was exactly the source of inspiration, because I've been to quite recently to a seminar about which deconstruct actually the concept of this museum. Nonetheless, I was then already thinking about my presentation. I thought, oh, that's a good idea. I'm going to propose that in my presentation, and I hope it's not going to be just a proposal for the sake of this presentation. Perhaps I would find people who would be willing to go into that direction with me. This is another topic for discussion. And Monika Stobiecka, yes, thank you very much for your question. I don't live in Poland, so it's very difficult for me to say, but hopefully, yes, local sites of resistance, perhaps they can function. They can function in, this is what happened under the so-called communist regime. There were centers of opposition everywhere, in your homes, in communities, at schools, everywhere. So virtual museums can exist anywhere. So I hope I addressed all the questions. I'm just checking now.
Yes, you did. I mean, as for now, and the rest we will need to leave for the breakout room. Jürgen, you will have a final word in this discussion, but maybe before that you would like to answer two specific questions which I already read before, the specificities of German colonialism and the current situation with current immigration waves.
Yeah, the problem is that the response to both questions takes easily a few hours. I mean, briefly, the question about what did change in colonialism between the 19th, early 20th century and then the mid 20th century experience. I mean, it's difficult to answer because colonialism is a 600-year project, and it encompasses literally the entire globus. And it's difficult to say what then changed. What I find interesting by comparing it to a specific case of German Southwest Africa is how very similar it is. The main difference is that the colonized people, the people constructed as those to be colonized, were in Europe. And you could break it down to individual measurements, which I found, this regulation in occupied Poland, that Polish people had to greet every German they meet on the pavement. You find exactly the same wording 40 years earlier in Namibia, where it doesn't make any sense at all, where you say every African has to greet every German or salute every German. It's just, a example which shows how deeply ingrained in a colonial mentality this was. What you have is, the scope from the people, the state involvement, the bureaucratization of the whole process, and the war itself, multiplied by factor 100, 1,000. That's why it's so difficult to compare. You have to break it down to the basic foundation. And colonialism is basically a racist endeavor, and it's a control of space through race. And if you break it down to that, then suddenly you can connect the German policies to Eastern Europe and the German policies in Africa, for example. And that is quite was quite interesting and quite allows a global approach to it. And that is why, I think if I understood Wayne correctly, is that I would argue that colonial endeavor stopped in 1990. No, the opposite is true. My argument is it did not stop. It just changed the geographical location. And I could give you Hitler quotes where he says Russia is our India, or Himmler quotes about the Poland as people who need to be colonized. I mean, that are more or less direct quotes. And I mean, then bringing this back to the question of migration and to the overall question by imposed, is the colonial time over? Is there a post-colonial time? Are we? No, we are not. I mean, isn't that the problem, that we are still in this colonial setup? Because if you break it down, colonialism created a deeply unjust world. On a global scale, the resources, the wealth, the universities, etc., are in the global north, and this exploitation, which we have for 600 years, it has produced this and is still ongoing. Now add China to this, which complicates matter, because I think we are now entering a phase from colonial globalization, as I'd like to call it, to post-colonial globalization. And that we have a shift in the direction. And suddenly, for 550 years, Europeans were moving to non-Europe, wherever this is, in terms of migration. And this is changing direction. At the same time, Europeans, financial imperialism, invested all over the world. Suddenly, it's Chinese investors investing in Europe. So this shift from colonial to post-colonial globalization is quite interesting. And now coming to this question about migration, I don't think that one has a direct relationship to the others, but those people who are not prepared to share their wealth with the global south are not very likely to accept responsibility for colonial wrongs and for colonial guilt. What we need is global social justice, simple as that. And colonialism is nothing but, the creation of a capitalist system which uses many more resources as we would have per capita. That is a European project. We as Europeans all use up much more resources than we should, with the effect that the rest of the world can use less, or if they start using more as well, we got into this climate emergency, which threatens now to kill us all within 1 or 2 generations. So engaging with the colonial world is the only way to unlearn this capitalist system and to reach global social justice and to get away from using more resources than we have, because otherwise we all are doomed. And that's why it's so important to engage with colonialism, because it's not over. And we have still not unlearned it. And that we have to do. And yes, we should restitute objects, because we should realize that this is a way to get to a new relationship. We as Europeans, it's a new relationship with the world. And we need to develop a new normal. Otherwise, we are doomed. Thank you.
Thank you, Jürgen, very much for something which was a great wrap-up of the entire conference. We should thank you. I would really like to thank wholeheartedly all the speakers on this panel. It was an absolutely fascinating discussion. And even though we've been for 4 days here, we were just, listening carefully to that what you have said, and that's going to help us to reshape and to rethink that what we are doing also here on the ground. So thank you very, very much.